Good evening and welcome everybody to the Leo Baeck Institute Jerusalem for the launch of Professor Vivian Liska's book, Kafka Omer Anachnu, When Kafka Says Yes. The book was originally published in 2008. Mani Amati. Originally published in 2008 in English. It came out now in the Hebrew translation with Mossad Bialik. And if I don't doubt, there will be a link for those online, or you can enter the website of Bialik. I think there is a special price for today if you want to buy the book. The question of we in the book has received in the current situation, I think, of October 7 and the war in the aftermath, a new relevancy and even urgency, one may say. And I think that will also come up in the later conversation. Before introducing our speakers tonight, I would like to welcome Galili Shachar, who is with us online from Berlin, for his greetings. Galili Shachar is professor of comparative literature and German studies at Tel Aviv University, and he serves currently as the chairman here of the Leo Baeck Institute in Jerusalem. His work is dedicated to research and teaching of German, Jewish, and Hebrew literatures and classical Persian literature. Among his publications are books on Goethe, Kafka, and Celan, and articles on Walter Benjamin, Gershom Scholem, Franz Rosenzweig, and Erich Auerbach. From 2013 to 20, he served as the director of the Minerva Institute for German History in Tel Aviv University. And from 2020, he was appointed the head of the School of Cultural Studies at the University of Tel Aviv. Galili, please.
Thank you very much, Irene. Good evening, dear colleagues and friends of the Leo Baeck Institute in Jerusalem. שוחרי המכון וידידיו, ברוכות הבאות וברוכים הבאים. ערב טוב, dear Vivian היקרה. We are delighted indeed and just here, Irene, to welcome you all this evening to discuss, to celebrate the Hebrew translations of Vivian Liska's book, כשקפקא אומר אנחנו. I'm really sorry for not being with you this evening, not able to be present in person in Jerusalem, but as an umbra, a shadow who speaks from the screen, from a distance. It is pity indeed. However, if I may, in the spirit of Vivian's book, to use, with your permission, the phrase we, wir, אנחנו, So being with you this evening, although from a distance, yet sharing with you the joy of having Vivian's books on German Jewish literary communities, a great contribution to our Hebrew shelf of German Jewish scholarship, a special contribution to Kafka's studies in Israel, alongside our study of Lasker Schüler, Walter Benjamin, Paul Celan, and Hannah Arendt. We will hear this evening 2 lectures by colleagues and dear friends, Chiara Cardona and Leora Bing-Eidiker, about the book, so it won't be proper to deliver another short lecture on Vivian's excellent essays. But, and with your permission, only a few words of gratitude and a short remark of her book. I was not asked, indeed, to deliver a title for this short, somewhat ghostly introduction of mine. If I were asked to do so, my title will be כשוויביאן אומרת אנחנו, when Vivian Liska says we. It will imply, first and foremost, an acknowledgement of her scholarship, her skills of close reading, critical thought, theoretical view, and intellectual creativity, which are always associated with academic and public engagement, generosity, and commitment. In her life and letters, Vivian is committed to express, to maintain complexities of belonging, tension of being with, that implies commitment and responsibility without, however, denying differences, gaps, at times, the impossibilities of being together. When Vivian says we, she refers to such a complex of belonging, which is not free from affinities and broken relationships, from the paradoxes of living in Europe and being in Israel-Palestine. When Vivian says we, she acknowledges belonging, yet not without a distance from the walls of tradition in relation to the Orthodox heritage. When she says we, she stands within, yet not without resistance, also to the academic milieu that perhaps and sometimes lost its orientation. The paradoxes of belonging being explored in her research of German Jewish writing, attesting at multiplicities, contradictions, and even distortions of being Jewish, are real. Belonging in those Jewish worlds was always accompanied by acts of denial, moments of entfremdung, acts of self-irony, while expressing the longing for communal life. Vivian chose to explore them first and foremost through literary lens and text, attesting how poetics hold those tensions of being and how literature itself becomes a place, a space of belonging. In the chapters of her book, beautifully written on Kafka, Lasker Schüler, and Benjamin Paul Celan, Hannah Arendt, the reader experiences different forms and modes of belonging, herself, that expressed in novels, stories, poems, essays, and political manifests by those German Jewish modernists, while often we're asking about remnants, the leftover of tradition. The dialectic of belonging being embedded in that speech act, we, as one hears in Kafka's writing, or as it sounds by the Oriental biblical figuration of Elsa Lasker Schüler short stories, is indeed of poetic nature. It implies not alone, if at all, a monological collective acknowledgement, a collapse of being Jewish into a vision of a nation or of an ethnic biopolitical community. No, it rather refers to broken affinities, acts of self-performance, a playful yet tragic experience that finds a proper expression in those literary acts, saying we. Those paradoxes of being distortive, yet transformative, to a certain extent experimental Jewish forms of life, are poetical indeed. Yet they were not fictitious, but rather hold reality of things to come. Lasker Schüler's Judeo-Arabic, Jewish-Muslim protagonist, Sheikh Yusuf and her types are among the most celebrated figures of that kind. Hybrid, queer, childish, crossing, escaping borderlines of ethnicity and gender, deconstructing yet demonstrating revealing the impossible possibilities and thus necessary association of being Jewish, being Arab, being together. For Vivian Liska recognized very well what was and what is real in those fictional literary distractions of Kafka, Lasker Schiller, or Paul Celan. They are not only great documentation of different biographical and historical constellations of being Jewish in the 20th century, symptoms of crisis in the realm of Jewish tradition, evidences of migration and of exile. In the writings, we, the readers, experience radical framing of the real. Better said, we experience in reading Kafka, reading Lasker Schiller, Benjamin, Celan, the potentials of becoming Jewish. When Vivian discusses Kafka's lecture on Yiddish and his somewhat uncanny remarks on the being of Western European Jewry, on being disconnected, when she touched upon Walter Benjamin's self-ironic, to a certain degree self-destructive reflection on migration or about leaving Europe, his biographical failures and hopeless hope, perhaps his real last testimony, while she deals with Hannah Arendt's discussion on Kafka's Das Schloss as the reference of a pariah, the being of the outcast, and when she refers to Paul Celan's remarks on Umkehr, inversion, or Verjudung as a mode of Jewish intervention in poetical language after 1945, she attests at the possibilities of a radical readership based on that impossible possibility, the necessity of saying we. There are many things that are left to say of this book, and more is to be heard of it this evening. In her book, Vivian refers, however, to the difficult task, perhaps the most difficult one, to which Kafka, Lasker Schiller, Benjamin, and Celan gave the word in dark times. The work of prayer. It is the prayer that we recall today for peace to come. For what is made broken by our own hands will find recovery and relief in our time. תודה.
תודה רבה, גלילי. Our first speaker will be Liora Bing-Heidecker. She's a ballet educator and a dance scholar, as well as a poet and translator. She was head of the Haifa Ballet School, the dance department of the Arts and Crafts High School in Haifa, and taught in other leading dance schools in Israel. Liora was a member of various professional dance boards and chaired numerous national committees in the field. She's currently a member of the Israeli Society for Dance Research, the International Exposure Advisory Committee for the Suzanne Delal Center in Tel Aviv, and a board member of the Agnon House in Jerusalem. Liora Bing-Heidecker translated texts by Jean Amery, Bertolt Brecht, Walter Benjamin, Alfred Döblin, Paul Valéry, Stéphane Mallarmé, Théophile Gautier, and many others. She won the Israeli Ministry of Culture Award for Poetry in 2001 and the Deutsch-Hebräischer Übersetzerpreis in 2020 for her translation of Else Lasker Schüller's early prose. Bing-Heidecker publishes articles in various international dance research venues, including the Oxford Handbook for Jewishness and Dance in 2022. A lecture, Else Lasker Schüller's Choreo Fantasy, a feminist ontology of becoming, that she gave here at the annual Else Lasker Schüller lecture 2 years ago, right? It was published in the yearbook of the European Literature Studies and Society. Liora, please.
Thank you very much, Irene. Good evening to you all. I'm thrilled and excited to be here again on the occasion of this heartwarming book launch. My expertise is dance, and in recent years, I'm particularly interested in the connections between dance and literature. Reading Vivian's exhilarating book, so masterfully translated into Hebrew, was a truly inspiring experience for me, loaded with associations covering such a wide array of ideas that I simply don't know where to begin. Let us start with the title and the cover. When Kafka says we, uncommon communities in German Jewish literature, a question mark is implicit here. What does it mean when Kafka uses the first person plural? When anybody says we? This is a particularly acute question, as Irene said, at the moment, since the imperative of sticking together and being united is a central issue in public discourse after the 7th of October. ביחד ננצח. But what is it that binds us all and makes us a community? Is it religion, faith, tradition, language, nationality? And not less important, what kind of action does it imply or demand of us as we? Throughout the book, Vivian masterfully and eloquently probes the texts of the German Jewish leading writers on their common ground, literature, language, words. These are our common means of communication, and yet through them, writers find ways of expressing their distinct individuality and defining their idiosyncrasies. It is therefore the task of this book to show how the use of common language by these writers tackles the aporia between we and I. It is interesting to note that the Hebrew root of the word community, kehillah, is related to the collective unanimity of an audience, kahal, and to the univocal body of a choir, makhelah. And moreover, the Greek word for choir, chorus, derives from chorea, namely dance, as in choreography, an orchestrated movement of a group. And if any of you ever sang or danced in a chorus, you surely know how hard it is to keep up with a group. In fact, this book made me think a lot about the rhetorical choreographies of its protagonists. The vacillating ambiguity of Kafka versus his language of force and movement that runs up against borders, confounding inside and outside, same and other, I and we, as Vivian says. Celan's from threshold to threshold that, and again, as Vivian says, describes a path, a movement of wandering. Benjamin's endless flânerie, not to speak of Else Lasker Schüller's choreo fantasy, of which I have already spoken here at length. So let us take a look at the cover of Vivian's book, a drawing, or rather a sketch by Kafka. What strikes me here is the astute sense of movement. None of the figures is depicted in a still or static position. At first glance, it even reminded me of a choreographer's sketchbook. Each figure is different.
One second. It's appeared now. It should be there.
Absolutely.
Yes, it's there.
Here it is. Good, good. No.
Can you visit the okay.
Here.
Yeah, okay.
Well, at first glance, it even reminded me of a choreographer's sketchbook. Each figure is different, yet they are all astride, moving in the same direction with the same orientation. And there is no ground under their feet to support them. They seem to be walking on air. Now let us perceive this image as a gesture of Kafka's mind. drawn or doodled, perhaps haphazardly, by his wandering hand. And let us think of a gesture in terms of a metaphor. A metaphor, says Vivian, is a literary image that remains open to multiple, even contradictory readings. That's a quote from the book. Metaphora or metaphorein in Greek actually means to transfer something from port to port. In other words, to convey. Literary language is thus a movement in the imagined world, a poetic gesture of conveying meaning by transposing images, by transporting images. Alas, it isn't a messianic teleological movement, since it never arrives at redemption. However, the inherent instability of metaphor that emanates from the nature of transportation is an immanent feature of dance, as Paul Valéry defined it, which is always in between, insinuative, evocative, suggestive, and never complete. I would like to propose that the protagonists of this book and a great deal of the tropes debated in it by Vivian have to do with a particular kind of dance qualities, which, like Kafka's figures, inhibit the liminal zone of in-betweenness, suspended in midair, never anchored or grounded. Uprootedness has always been associated with Jewish life in the diaspora. However, it was also typical of the inquisitive and experimental orientation of modernism and characteristic of modern dance, seeking for new directions through its constant shifts of balance, falls, and contractions. The colossal undercurrent of dance that swept Europe at the outburst of modernism remained a prominent force throughout the 20th century, reflecting modernism in a most direct, non-verbal manner. It thus quickly became a desired model for other art forms, including writers and poets. But it is not far-fetched to suggest that in some way Kafka, Celan, Benjamin, and certainly Else Lasker Schiller felt a kind of affinity, perhaps attraction, I'm grappling for the right word here, toward the performative, toward the pre-verbal aspects of language. The historian Yuri Slezkin argued that the 20th century was the Jewish century, since the history of exile on the limen of society rendered the Jews capable of adjusting to the modern world so well that they have become models of what it means to be modern. It is also true that no one could express the rift of modernism better than the wandering Jew, carrying on his shoulder the burden of the we, as well as the aspirations and wounds of the I. Hence Celan's famous words, also quoted by Vivian, all poets are Jews. But if the qualities of dance hold the essence of the zeitgeist, and Jews represent the essence of modernism, one could paraphrase Celan's dictum. I would like to put it to you that all who inhabited the language of modern dance were Jews. Of course, to say that all poets are Jews is metaphorical, as Derrida pointed out, and to say that all dancers are Jews is certainly metaphorical. But isn't metaphor itself an expressive gesture, almost a dance? So while fluctuations, oscillations, and dislocations become paradigms of modernism, and dance was hailed as modernism's embodied non-verbal image, it is only natural that choreography, or écriture corporelle, bodily writing as Mallarmé termed it, was looked upon as a poetic actualization of literary ideas, and vice versa. Dance incorporated literary ideas and understood itself accordingly as moving poetry. Let us look closer from this point of view at one of the tropes that Vivian discusses in the book, that of Hunter Gracchus, which she considers to be a central point of engagement between Celan and Kafka. The figure of Hunter Gracchus, a living dead man who was doomed to wander aimlessly and eternally over the seas, is in a sense a variation of an old and very prevalent literary trope, as for instance, Heine's Flying Dutchman, who is fated for eternal seafaring, or in other words, cursed to stay forever without a rudder, denied of redemption. Hunter Gracchus seems to be related to another earring phantom that had been cursed with permanent liminality, that of Achashverosh, the wandering Jew. A similar phantom, or spectre, is also the departure point of Marx's Communist Manifesto, pointing out the ailment of the world, just as it is the beginning of Pinsker's auto-emancipation, pointing out the illness of Jewish society. Derrida suggested that this figure of the ghost, the living dead, is in fact a mark of the modern age, a mark that becomes more and more acute as time is out of joint, and the world less coherent and stable. But let us not forget, the main quality of the living dead is a dance quality. An endless, compulsive chain dance, a danse macabre. Danse macabre that moves across time and space. In fact, Hunter Gracchus joins this universal dance community that culminated at the turn of the century. It was Paul Valéry's famous comparison between a poem and dance, contending that neither ever comes to an end unless it is arbitrarily stopped, because neither the one nor the other has any end, any purpose beyond simply being what they are. And apropos Kafka's lecture about Yiddish, this reminds me of an early short story written in Yiddish by Agnon in 1908. Teutentanz is the name of the story. The protagonist of Teutentanz, Danse Macabre, brings the writer regards from her late husband, Raphael, who on his deathbed, I quote, remembers the tale about the ship of the Flying Dutchman, which appears whenever a ship is about to sink. Then Raphael understood that when an important Jew is about to die, the eternal Jew appears. Let us look again at Kafka's drawing. It's still here. I see a procession, a community. I have to think of the so prevalent Tanzchor of the era. Well, certainly a community of an uncommon kind, perhaps a dance choir of individuals. Here, the page is an ad hoc stage. Ein herrlicher Spielraum, a fabulous playground, as Benjamin called Kafka's space of ambivalence beyond resolution. And so, I'm quoting Valerie again, permit me to put it rather boldly, might one not consider the dance as a kind of inner life? End of quote. Kafka, Celan, Benjamin, and Lasker Schüler were all, in a metaphorical sense, dancers who found ways of performing their innermost gestures on the fabulous playground of their immortal writings. Thank you all. Thank you, Vivian, so much for your time.
ממש תודה, ליאורה. I now would like to introduce you to Chiara Caradonna. She's a senior lecturer at the Department of Romance Studies and Comparative Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research is devoted to modern and contemporary European poetry on the one hand, and the excessive novel that defies the genre formal boundaries on the others. In this context, she's interested in the intersections between literature, philosophy, anthropology, photography, and cinema. And in her book titled Opaque Shadows of Knowledge in the Meridian, and in the poem Schwanengefahr that was published in 2020 at Waldstein, she analyzed epistemological and hermeneutic aspects of Paul Celan's later poetry. She has published on Paul Valéry and Edmund Husserl, Pier Paolo Pasolini and Osip Mandelstam, Hannah Arendt and Gustav Landauer, and on the German contemporary poet Rainer René Müller. Lately, she has been focusing on the modern and contemporary literature of southern Italy and Sicily in particular, investigating the modern reception of its Arab Muslims past on the one hand, and the depiction of fishermen communities in literatures and film on the other. Chiara.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Adi. אני רואה אותך. Okay, יופי. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to be here with you today to celebrate the publication of the Hebrew translation of Vivian's book, When Kafka Says We, Uncommon Communities in 20th Century German Jewish Literature, כשקפקא אומר אנחנו, קהילות אחרות, which is not the same as uncommon, קהילות אחרות במודרניזם יהודי גרמני. It is an important book, a relevant book, complex, necessary, and challenging, in general terms and for myself in particular. As I sent out my short biography that you just heard towards our meeting this evening, I suddenly realized that it contains the word community. It's always the same. I didn't change it extra for this meeting. And the next semester, I will be teaching a course precisely on the concept of community. And I hope, Vivian, you'll come visit us. Community, the concept, and the modern imaginations tied to it has indeed been a recurring theme in my own reflection, which has happened mostly through and with the authors that Vivian discusses in her book, among others. So much so that while rereading the book, I have been asking myself what came first, my interest for community, for mechanisms of belonging, marginality, marginalization, and exclusion, which then drew me to the authors that handle this topic, or on the contrary, whether my early passion for Kafka and Celan has sparked this very interest and made me sensitive for what Vivian describes as the ambiguities of community. I guess this is the classical chicken and egg question, which I will never be able to answer univocally, but it is startling to observe in Vivian's dense survey how the reflection on community is fundamentally embedded in the works of Kafka and his more or less willing companions and heirs, from Else Lasker Schüler, Nelly Sachs, and Paul Celan, through Theodor Herzl and up to Robert Schindel and Robert Menasse in more recent times, without forgetting Hannah Arendt, of course. Vivian shows poignantly, elegantly, and precisely how the problem, issue, question of community, all these things at once, which these authors address as part of a larger cultural and political debate taking place in Europe in the past couple of centuries, is additionally sharpened by their Jewish diasporic viewpoint. When discussing these authors' stances on the matter, Vivian problematizes anew the dash between German and Jewish that is part of her book's title, and of which she is one of the foremost experts. German Jewish literature, Vivian observes, and I'm quoting, should not be regarded as a fixed and definable category or essence, but as the result of a focus, a set of questions asked in the process of reading and interpreting individual texts. Quote end. In other words, it is the very dash that makes these authors exceptionally aware of the tensions between and inside communities and attuned to the need of exploring ways to conciliate between I and we, between us and them, between self and other. In fact, it is important to note that Vivian is more interested, she writes, and I quote, in the implications of the way these authors configure communities as such, rather than in the particular relation these authors have with the Jewish community. Quote end. This approach opens the reflection that Vivian develops through Kafka and the others far beyond the specificity of each author's thought and the historical contextualization that Vivian carefully lays out throughout the book. When Kafka Says We is not only one of Vivian's most personal books. At the end of the introduction, she explains that, and I quote, the awareness of the attractions and problems involved in saying we originated for her in a life spent simultaneously in the midst and outside of various communities, quote end. It is also one of her more acutely actual books, as Galili and Liora already said. At this very time and in this very place, as the word beyachad, together, by Zam, resounds at every corner. This book lends itself to be read as Celan, one of the authors that Vivian discusses, would have it under the akut des heutigen, the acute of that which happens today. It addresses questions that we urgently need to raise anew and answer boldly, while looking for, as Kafka and the other protagonists of this book did, alternative modes of togetherness. These authors and their works may, through Vivian's lucid analysis and interpretation, guide us towards a way out of communities withdrawing into themselves. And here I'll need a slide. They formulate a critique of closed communal entities, as well as the myths, traditions, and beliefs by which such communities legitimize themselves, quote end. Else Lasker Schüler, for example, strive to create, as Vivian reminds us, bonds across ethnic and religious borders. We can proceed. As I reread Vivian's book and ventured into the intricacy of the first person plural in Kafka's writing that Vivian so precisely illustrates through striking examples, I thought again about personal pronouns. The white slide. This was an anticipation. The renowned French Jewish linguist Émile Benveniste, who was born in Aleppo in 1902, points out that no human language lacks the pronouns I and you, and more importantly, that I and you are interdependent. There is no I, no subject, without a you that it addresses, and vice versa. According to Benveniste, these two personal pronouns are exceptional and unique linguistic components, as they have no fixed referent and can each time be inhabited, appropriated by a new speaker. In fact, Benveniste writes, and I quote, I refers to the individual speech act in which it is pronounced, and it indicates the speaker. Through the first person singular, language becomes personal, an individual, unique act of speech that testifies to its user's participation in the community of speakers. When I say I and you say I, we definitely don't mean the same person, though this little yet incredibly spacious word is the same. Personal pronouns and other so-called deictic terms like now, here, there, today, and yesterday refer to the present of speech, which is why they are so interesting and complex when they appear in a literary text coming from the past. There they raise the question of who is speaking and to whom. They can be said to reactivate the text each time a reader approaches them and actualizes them. This actualizes this individual act of speech into a new present. But what about the first person plural? We. Benveniste observes that we is not simply the plural form of I, because he says, unicity and subjectivity of the first person singular that I just described contradict the possibility of building a plural form. I cannot be multiplied. Or as Stéphane Moses summarized it when writing about Benveniste, and now we can proceed, I designates a singular and irreducible reality which resists dissolution in an impersonal collective. Quote end. We concludes Benveniste is thus the result of a connection between I and non-I. However, these components are not equal, since in the framework of this we, there is always an I that predominates. To say we, there needs to be an I that, and these are Benveniste's words, subjugates the element non-I. This is particularly evident in Kafka's short text Gemeinschaft, community, that Vivian analyzes brilliantly in the book's first chapter. 5 friends, like the fingers on a hand, come out of a house together. They don't really know each other, but stay together anyway and systematically exclude a 6th person who apparently wants to join the group, pushing him away. This community, as Vivian aptly observes, lives through the existence of the pariah. This pariah, however, keeps coming, as the story's final words tell us. Vivian sharply notes that the speaker introduces himself in the first person. This is not the one. Okay. The speaker introduces himself in the first person plural, but when he enumerates the members of the group, he becomes impersonal. We don't know who among the 5 the speaker exactly is. Vivian deduces from this that the use of the impersonal form implies the disappearance of his individuality. Chazara. I would like to suggest with Benveniste another possible reading. Throughout the text, the speaker maintains his dominance over the others, both those within and the one outside the group. It is he who establishes in the first sentence that we are 5 friends, who claims that we are 5 and don't want to be 6, that we don't want a new association, and who decides that they shouldn't even start talking to the 6th person. Indeed, such a conversation would imply the rupture of the we into an I and you of a dialogue. In no moment do we hear any other voice or opinion. The speaker seems endowed with the power to unify the group, and no disagreement, resistance, or dissent is expressed against the collective violence committed against the 6th person. At the end, my and Vivian's conclusion are the same. The rejection of the pariah is nothing but a means of holding the group together. This is a quotation from the book. I only wish to stress a will on the side of the speaker to preserve this group in his own interest. The group's behavior illustrates the double meaning of the term gemein, which forms part of the German word for community, Gemeinschaft. Gemein means both common and mean. Someone here establishes his own position of power over a community united in cruelty. Kafka's handling of the notion of community is bound to create discomfort and unease in the community itself, as Vivian underlines in her interpretation of Kafka's famous speech on the Yiddish theater. Less than half a century later, in a world after the Shoah, Celan, as Vivian lays out in her detailed interpretation of his early poem Vor einer Kerze, in front of a candle, performs in his poems an act of liberation from communal consensus. And a cry of protest against the horrors perpetrated in the name of a violently exclusive communal frenzy. This is in line with the revolutionary tradition that Celan inscribes himself in by referring explicitly, among others, to figures such as Gustav Landauer and Rosa Luxemburg. As regards to Celan, Vivian is less interested in mapping out systematically when and how he says we. Instead, she concentrates on instances in which his refusal of common places and his loss of communal bonds, with the exception of those linking him to the dead, come to the fore. This appears evident in another, later poem written by Celan in 1963 that I would like to read through Vivian's very fruitful angle, while expanding the reflection on pronouns to include also a preposition that is crucial when thinking about community, not least because of its etymological connection, cum, with, mit. It would be also worthwhile to explore the use of bei in German. Indeed, Vivian's study offers an inspiring blueprint for future research on this topic. The short poem included in the collection Atemwende, Breath Turn, is titled With the Persecuted. You have here Pierre Joris's English translation. Mit dem Verfolgten in spätem, unverschwiegenem, strahlendem Bund. Das Morgenlot, übergoldet, heftet sich dir an die mitschwörende, mitschürfende, mitschreibende Verse. In the introduction to the book, Vivian explains that the German Jewish authors she discusses question the foundation of community based on a principle of identity and sameness, of having something in common. This is a quotation. This implies that the conditions for the formation of a community are given beforehand, for example, by birth, and are a matter of fate and necessity rather than of choice. What about then communities of choice that go beyond pre-established communal borders and are based on the wish and the will to share something rather than to include or to exclude? Strikingly, there is no pronoun in the first person, singular or plural, in this poem. As so often in Celan's poetry, the second person singular, in this case in the passive form dir, marks the definition of that speaking I through a Gegenüber, a you, very much in the spirit of Benveniste's analysis that Celan was very well familiar with. Instead of defining a community through a we, that is, as Kafka's stories illustrated, so difficult to establish without an act of imposition by the speaker, Celan opts for a recurring mit, with. The first line answers the question, with whom are you siding? The speaker answers, with the persecuted. The repetitive, insistent exposition of the pronoun in the second stanza echoes its use at the end of Celan's Gespräch im Gebirg, Conversation in the Mountains, another key text on uncommon communities. When Jud Klein says, when little Jew says, ich mit dem Türkenbund links, ich mit der Rapunzel, ich mit der heruntergebrannten der Kerze, ich mit dem Tag, ich mit den Tagen. The pronoun mit, with, allows to pledge an alliance, an allegiance that remains respectful of the other and has to name him or her explicitly, that requires of the I to give space to the one it allies with, as she defines him or herself through this specific relation. This kind of construction can be traced throughout Celan's poetry. Much more could obviously be said about Mit dem Verfolgten that I leave for the discussion, maybe. Let me just remark that in the English translation, some of the poem's very dense biblical intertextuality is lost. The word Bund recalls both the Brit and the Yiddish labor Bund. Lot, is both a physical weight and a figure from Bereshit, as the story of Sodom looms in the background. Who is here the persecuted, and persecuted by whom? The allusion to biblical episodes of exclusion and expulsion make answering this question a much less straightforward task than expected. The heel that closes the poem might recall Esau's heel that Jacob held on to, but then the speaker would identify with Esau, making the whole net of belonging and allegiance all the more complex. Siding with the persecuted seems, in Celan's understanding, to create bonds that transcend a notion of community based on the principle of identity. This reading is further substantiated by another subtle and unexpected intertextual reference, Hedwig Lachmann's poem Mit den Besiegten. Lachmann, born in 1865 and died in 1918, a German Jewish writer and translator, married Gustav Landauer in 1903, who in turn published her collected poems after her death. This 1919 volume is preserved in Celan's library, and I read Mit dem Verfolgten as engaging in a dialogue with Lachmann's earlier poem. Lachmann's pledge of alliances, for one, much more explicit and univocal than Celan's, as she states that her wish to suffer humiliation with the defeated, and exclaims to side with the humblest people, frowned upon, vilified, ravaged, as if they originated from the same trunk. As Celan, Lachmann too utters a cry of protest that forcefully articulates her pacifist stance during World War I, which culminates in the last stanza, which you have here. Weit lieber doch besiegt sein als verführt von eitlem Glanz, und wenn auch am Verschmachten, und doch man gleich den Fuß im Nacken spürt, den Sieger und das Siegerglück verachten.
When was this?
During the First World War, we don't know exactly. Against the background of Lachmann's poem, Celan's reference to the golden weight and the heel acquire new dimension that would deserve more in-depth analysis. I wish to close my remarks inspired by Vivian's rich, nuance, and fundamental questioning of communities and their ambiguities by lingering with the poem's titles. What is the difference between expressing solidarity with the defeated and with the persecuted? What does Celan imply when basing his response to Lachmann on his significant substitution? Certainly, this change must be read against the respective historical backdrop of both poems. But I wish to suggest an additional aspect of Celan's choice. Defeat signals an end. The defeated are on the losing end of someone else's victory, which definitely seals a confrontation. This is not the case for the persecuted. Albeit continuous and viciously persistent in time, persecution can be stopped, interrupted, resisted, fought, and rebelled against. The community of the persecuted is not entirely impotent. Among other things, in this case, in Celan's poem, it prompts the speaker to write. Something Celan writes in another poem from 1966, Adi, stays with us, the ones who are tossed about, yet traveling. Mit uns, den Umhergeworfenen, dennoch Fahrenden. Der eine, unversehrte, nicht usurpierbare, aufständische Gram. Thank you very much.
Daraba. And now I don't know if I have to introduce Vivian to you, but I will do this. Vivian is professor of German literature, director of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And for the last 10 years, she has been a distinguished visiting professor here at the Faculty of the Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has published extensively on literature theory, German modernism, and German Jewish authors and thinkers. And I just want to mention some more books she's written. In 2017 came out German Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife. In 2016, Kafka in the Universal. In 2015, The German Jewish Experience Revisited. And yeah, right. Shalom Steve. And she's the editor of the book series Perspectives on Jewish Texts and Contexts with De Gruyter, and the co-editor of the Yearbook of the Society of European Jewish Literatures, as well as Arcadia International Journal of Literature Studies. Please.
Thank you. This is overwhelming, and I'm deeply grateful to all those who made this possible. And there are many. All of you, Irene, Sharon, was their initiative. So really thank you. Galili was beautiful words. And of course, Liora and Chiara, can't thank you enough for your thoughtfulness, your original, attentive comments, remarks, quotes, bringing yourself to it, your own passions and interests, and engaging with my book in that way. So really, thank you so much. Whatever's been said here, mentioned in one way or the other in passing, the relevance of the title of my book, or at least part of it, for today. What it means to say we these days is indeed an essential and omnipresent question. I wish that my book come out in different circumstances. As things are, your comments have contributed to making me realize to what extent this question is present with us, this question of saying we, what it means, what it includes and excludes, what it resonates with, and how it flares up in times of catastrophe. They illuminate the complex issues of belonging, of solidarity, of loyalty, of communality. Liora, you asked, what is it that binds us and makes us into a community? Is it religion or language, faith, tradition, nationality? Each one of these possibilities highlights a fault line in the setup of our situation and society today. Chiara, you mentioned and problematized the current omnipresent beyachad. How can a book hold when Kafka says we about German Jewish modernist writers written, so the book written way before our present time address these issues? I will come back at the end to this question of today. The first sentence of my book is a famous Kafka quote. What have I in common with Jews? I have barely anything in common with myself and should put myself quietly in a corner, content that I can breathe. The question at the beginning of this quote is rather simple. What do I have in common with Jews? The answer is not. Having barely anything in common with myself suggests an internal disunity, a split that could point to dilemmas within oneself. My book explores the complexity of this quote for Kafka and its meaning for an understanding of other German Jewish modernists, but it also highlights the terms of this dilemma within ourselves, within myself, at least today. Beyachad, Yachad Menatzeach has been quoted. Together we are strong. It says in front of the Tachana Rishona. Are today an important call for unity in the face of danger, but they also occlude factual divisions in our society. They repress critical voices and potentially the capacity of empathy with others, those who do not belong to the we. Kafka and the other authors I'm discussing in my book were aware of both the attractions and the dangers of saying we. The benefits of belonging to a cohesive community, safety, security, support, solidarity, as well as the perils associated with it. The tendency of forced homogenization, in the horrible German word Gleichschaltung, of the inside of this group and the inevitable exclusion of others, those with whom one might eventually enter or have to enter into dialogue. And I loved, Chiara, how you explained how as soon as you start in Kafka's story, as soon as one starts talking to somebody, the we is no longer cohesive completely because there is already another that you have to count with. My book highlights the literary means by which the authors I discuss express themselves. They activate literature's unique potential of holding seemingly incompatible attitudes together, of conveying both the attractions and the dangers simultaneously. The book also examines the author's attempts to portray and affirm alternative modes of togetherness and to suggest instances of relations, alliances, and shared experiences across dividing lines that avoid or counteract these dangers. These authors in my book certainly don't give us solutions, but they raise an awareness of dilemmas that may allow us to deal with them more lucidly. To Liora, you introduce your own expertise and passion of dance in beautiful, elegant ways, and you associate it with literature and poetry. Your description of the cover of my Hebrew book is magnificent and reveals aspects of it that I wasn't aware of, such as the fact that the figures are indeed dancing and that they have no ground under their feet. And the idea of a procession, I suddenly saw in it a caricature of, the other of soldiers marching. And I can just see the eye of the caricaturist who brings out the idiosyncrasy, as you said, of each one of them. Your description was really an eye-opener for me. Now, Kafka knew quite a lot about having no stable ground to stand on. He has this beautiful expression that the firm ground under him is exactly as wide as the outline of his feet. He's less often associated with dancing. In his letter to his father, Kafka writes that the only situation in which he was as bored as in the synagogue was in his dance lesson. Yet, but it's all the father's fault, mind you, for having given him this nothing of Judaism. And there is a book in the making by a friend and colleague who is present here, Eli Schoenfeld, with a very significant chapter about this letter. So yet there is, even though Kafka is rarely associated with dance, although you have done so very convincingly, there is in Kafka's writing an explicit reference to dance that specifically relates to the questions we are discussing here this evening. In Researches of a Dog, Kafka describes a specific dance form, der Reigen, the round dance, probably the equivalent in Hebrew of a hora. And there's this beautiful Matisse painting of a round dance. And I'm quoting where Kafka describes that. The way they raised and set down their feet, certain turns of their head, their running and their resisting, the attitudes they assumed toward one another, the combinations they formed with one another like a round dance. But they all do that in similar fashion. These round dance-like constellations are created by figures of interrelatedness performed with, Kafka writes, mit großartiger Sicherheit, with magnificent certainty, and could be read in a positive sense as a sign of desirable self-confidence. But the image of the ring, implying a closed circle, seems to gain a clearly negative connotation in another prose text where Kafka addresses the constitution of a community in its most explicit form, and that is the counterpart of the text Chiara, that you presented here and that I discuss in my book. That one was Gemeinschaft. This one is Gemeinschaft von Schurken, where the round dance is mentioned again. It is a little text about a community in which every intervention by an individual, who ever so slightly deviates from the norm of the group, is immediately being processed. He has to confess, it's being investigated, analyzed, and Kafka really describes how this has to happen so that the Gleichschaltung can occur. In this way, Kafka sarcastically ends, they always stood by each other. And even after death, they did not desert the community. So it is not unto death, they are together, but even after death. But they rose to heaven, dancing in a ring, in einem Reigen. But when they arrive up there, they are smashed into pieces. The round dance, the closed circle in which all faces are turned toward each other and are blind to anything that lies outside it, will be destroyed in the face of the heavens, the absolute. When they arrive up there, wahre Felsblöcke. I have many other things I need to discuss with you. For example, Celan's very important quote of Marina Tsvetaeva, all poets are Jews. And Derrida's explanation that this is metaphoric. I give a third option, namely that this poem was written by Marina Tsvetaeva, and when she was, after she was remembering her walk with her lover alongside the walls of the ghetto. And she was outside of the ghetto and she pointed over the wall and said, all poets are Jews. I think it is very different when Celan quotes it as a poet, and as a Jewish poet himself. I can understand that Derrida felt the need to say that this was metaphoric, but I think that the alternative of seeing in the gesture that this is something else, when you say this as you point to something that is on the other side of the wall, makes yet another difference. And many other things, because I was inspired by, maybe we can talk about the other things afterwards, because some of them were really challenging and bringing me further into thoughts that I want to share with you. I just want to quote, yes, I had this somewhere. I will do it more or less by heart. Because I said that I'm particularly interested in places where the two, the attraction and the dangers, come together. And there is a passage in which it's in the Great Wall of China, where Kafka describes this feeling of unity. And it goes something like this. Einheit, Einheit, eine Brust neben der anderen und es fließt das Blut durch uns alle, nicht länger nur in einem kleinen Körper, sondern durch das ganze China. And you can see, now I read this and I thought this is a wonderful parody of that feeling. And then I read in one of the important Kafka scholars, Hartmut Binder, where he says this was a moment that captures perfectly how Kafka at that moment felt one with the Jewish people. And, you know, I still don't know. But the very fact that it can be read in these two ways will stay with us, Chiara. the poem Mit uns. There again, just so many things that I will discuss with you directly, but I want to continue on the thoughts you had with the Mit uns, which you beautifully described as implying a certain distance. Interestingly, that language has these things where something that suggests proximity at the same time implies that you're not appropriating, but that you are at some distance from. So it's mit uns. And I want to just add, you ended it on this and almost invited me to pick up on it. Because I think that this poem really shows the power of language to hold different, seemingly incompatible things together. Mit uns, den umhergeworfenen, dennoch Fahrenden. Now, mit uns suggests a philosophically loaded term, especially when you see how it continues, the idea of Mitsein, a Heideggerian term. And when in the next verse it says die umhergeworfenen, this inevitably brings up the Heideggerian idea of Geworfenheit, to be thrown, the thrownness, which was, you know, the central sense that Heidegger conveyed of beings, that they are thrown into the world. But Celan, who admired Heidegger in many ways, and at the same time kept his distance and wrote poetry about that. Mit uns den umhergeworfenen, with us those thrown about, thrown from here to there, which is a beautiful critique and comment on the Geworfenheit. So those thrown about, the displaced, the hunted, the expelled, we, the nevertheless traveling, the nevertheless not remaining in fixity. Now, die Fahrenden in German poetry very often refer to Rilke's famous Fahrende, the vagabonds, the nomads, the circus people. Diese noch etwas zerbrechlicheren als wir alle, those who are the somewhat more fragile than we all are, die Fahrenden. But I think that in Celan, this Fahrende here has yet another meaning. It really opposes the idea of blood and soil ideology, that it is not because of having been thrown here and there, not of having been in exile and expelled, that we therefore need to have a fixity. But, and here, and this is why I find this poem amazing, I've dealt quite a lot with the problematic celebration of the exilic state. It is especially in French philosophy, but taken up also in American theory of, theories that take cosmopolitanism beyond that, namely into a kind of, the beautiful uprootedness, the fantastic nomad, which is metaphoric for the intellectual who is at home nowhere. And just, I think that this poem gives a very strong counterweight to this, without, however, falling into the opposite of, of that kind of rootedness in soil. Because with us, what is with us here? The one unharmed, not usurpable, rebellious grief. Der Gram ist mit uns. It is the grief that is with us, those who have been umhergeworfen. Now, what is behind, and this is maybe to explain why this trope of the wonderful nomad and you know, the exilic as a, you know, as a desirable state, because especially in relation to Jews, it is the alternative of das portative Vaterland, of the portable homeland, which is the book. So the people are the Jews are the people of the book, and therefore don't need a homeland. It is quite a paper-thin protection, but that's the idea. Now, Celan did associate the Jews with the people of the book and of the letter repeatedly. But what we have here in the last word, gram, and this may be stretching it just a little bit, but gram means grief. But gram is also the Greek for grammaton, the letter. So what is with us is the rebellious grammaton, the rebellious letter with which Celan identified his own poetry. Oh, I found the quote. Should I read it to you in English? It's just, and then you will decide maybe if this is a parody or if this is a moment of intense solidarity. Wie groß und reich und schön und liebenswert ihr Land war. Jeder Landsmann war ein Bruder. Every fellow countryman was a brother, for whom they were building a protective wall, and who was thankful all his life, thankful with everything that he had and was. Unity, unity, breast on breast, a round dance of the people, blood no longer confined in a meager circulatory system of the body, but rolling on sweetly and yet returning to its source through the infinity of China. Okay, and now my end. I want to pick up a passage in my acknowledgements in my book that led Chiara to speak of this as my personal book. Very few have noticed this so far, Chiara. Chiara was quoting so I'm quoting Chiara now. When Kafka Says We is not only one of Vivian's most personal works, at the end of the introduction, she explains that the awareness of the attractions and problems involved in saying we originated for me in a life spent simultaneously in the midst and outside of various communities. If it has gone almost unnoticed, it is because this was originally over a page long and the only autobiographical note ever in my published work. I felt that it gave away too much. So all that remained was this vague sentence about various communities. I left it at that, for fear of sounding as if I was boasting about this, and maybe also of seeming different, opportunistic, when possibly holding different views when I was inside and outside of these various communities. I would probably still do the same today, leaving it at that sentence. But this occasion here today gives me the opportunity to speak out and elaborate on this half sentence in view of the circumstances of today. The tension between the contradictory stances I was sometimes led to holding shifted since October 7. I still live here and there, inside and outside, of various communities. But the terms of this constellation are no longer the same. I live about half a year in Israel and half a year in Antwerp and elsewhere. When I'm here, I'm with the protesters and those dismayed about the failure of accountability of our leaders and other failures. I also feel with pain the divisiveness and often outright hostility between segments of this society, but also genuine pride when faced with the multiplicity of voices present here. As I said in the beginning, I'm aware of both the necessity and the dangers of saying we, also now, but these are not simultaneous. When I'm abroad and experience on a daily basis the violent and, with important exceptions, widespread, outright hatred targeting this country and its population. Yes, its very existence, and this ever since October 8, when I fight on behalf of a we against outrageous petitions, calls for boycott of Israeli universities, and accusations of genocide directed at us, I no longer ask myself what I have in common with Jews or with Israelis. More than ever, I feel divided about many issues and might have very little in common with myself when I speak differently here and there, inside and outside. But in the face of the hostility hurled at us, I can live with that split and out there speak on behalf of one wounded, vulnerable we that will hopefully recover soon and sufficiently to be able to afford again all the diversity, disagreement, and multiplicity it can bear. Thank you.
So thank you very much for Vivian and all of you. And I think we're closing the evening. Thanks for coming and come back home. Good night. Bye.